Of the other religions with which the Jews came in contact and which more or less were in conflict with their own monotheistic belief, very little is definitely known, since their sacred books, if they had any, have not come down to us. Our knowledge is mostly confined to monuments on which the names of their deities are inscribed, the animals which they worshipped, symbolic of the powers of nature, and the kings and priests who officiated in religious ceremonies. From these we can learn or infer that among the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Phoenicians, religion was polytheistic, but without so complicated or highly organized a system as prevailed in Egypt. Only about 20 deities are alluded to in the monumental records of either nation, and they are supposed to have represented the sun, the moon, the stars, and various other powers to which were delegated by the unseen and occult supreme deity, the oversight of this world. They presided over cities and the elements of nature like the rain, the thunder, the winds, the air, the water. Some abode in heaven, some on the earth, and some in the waters under the earth. Of all these graven images existed, carved by men's hands, some in the form of animals like winged bulls of Nineveh. In the very earliest times before history was written, it is supposed that the religion of all these nations was monotheistic, and that polytheism was a development as men became wicked and sensual. The knowledge of the one God was gradually lost, although an indefinite belief remained that there was a supreme power over all the other gods, at least a deity of higher rank than the gods of the people who reigned over them as Lord of Lords. This deity in Assyria was Ashur. He is recognized by most authorities as Ashur, a son of Shem and grandson of Noah, who was probably the hero and leader of one of the early migrations, and as founder of the Assyrian Empire gave it its name, his own being magnified and deified by his warlike descendants. Assyria was the oldest of the great empires occupying Mesopotamia, the vast plain watered by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, with adjacent countries to the north, west, and east. Its seat was in the northern portion of this region, while that of Babylonia or Chaldea, its rival, was in the southern part. And although after many wars freed from the subjection of Assyria, the institutions of Babylonia, and especially its religion, were very much the same as those of the elder empire. In Babylonia, the chief god was called El, or Il. In Babylon, although Bab-El, their tutelary god, was at the head of the pantheon, his form was not represented, nor had he any special temple for his worship. The Assyrian Ashur placed kings upon their thrones, protected their armies, and directed their expeditions. In speaking of him, it was Ashur, my lord. He was also called King of Kings, reigning supreme over the gods, and sometimes he was called the Father of the Gods. His position in the celestial hierarchy corresponds with the Zeus of the Greeks and with the Jupiter of the Romans. He was represented as a man with a horned cap, carrying a bow and issuing from a winged circle, with which circle was the emblem of ubiquity and eternity. This emblem was also the accompaniment of Assyrian royalty. These Assyrian and Babylonian deities had a direct influence on the Jews in later centuries, because traders on the Tigris pushed their adventurous expeditions from the head of the Persian Gulf, either around the great peninsula of Arabia or by land across the deserts, and settled in Canaan, calling themselves Phoenicians. And it was from the descendants of these enterprising but morally debased people that the children of Israel, returning from Egypt, received the most pertinacious influences of idolatrous corruption. In Phoenicia, the chief deity was also called Bel, or Baal, meaning Lord, the epithet of the one divine being who rules the world, or the Lord of Heaven, the deity of the Egyptian pantheon with whom Baal most nearly corresponds was Ammon, addressed as the supreme god. Ranking after El in Babylon, Ashur in Assyria, and Baal in Phoenicia, all shadows of the same supreme god. We notice among these Mesopotamians a triad of the great gods called Anu, Bel, and Hea. Anu, the primordial chaos, Hea, life and intelligence animating matter, and Bel, the organizing and creative spirit, or as Rawlinson thinks, the original gods of the earth, the heavens, and the waters, corresponding in the main with the classical Pluto, Jupiter, and Neptune, who divided between them the dominion over the visible creation. The god Bel in the pantheon of the Babylonians and Assyrians is the god of gods and Father of gods, who made the earth and heaven. His title expresses dominion. In succession to the gods of the first trio, Anu, Bel, and Hea, was another trio named Siu, Shamas, and Vul, representing the moon, the sun, and the atmosphere. In Assyria and Babylon, the moon god took precedence of the sun god, since night was more agreeable to the inhabitants of these hot countries than the day. Hence, Siu was the more popular deity, but Shamas, the sun, as having most direct reference to physical nature, the lord of fire, the ruler of the day, was the god of battles, going forth with the armies of the king triumphant over enemies. The worship of this deity was universal, and the kings regarded him as affording them especial help in war. Vul, the third of this trinity, was the god of the atmosphere, the god of tempests, the god who caused the flood, which the Assyrian legends recognize. He corresponds with the Jupiter Tonans of the Romans, the prince of the power of the air, destroyer of crops, the scatterer of the harvest, represented with a flaming sword, but as god of the atmosphere, the giver of rain, of abundance, the lord of fecundity. He was beneficent as well as destructive. All these gods had wives resembling the goddesses in the Greek mythology, some beneficent, some cruel, rendering aid to men or pursuing them with their anger. And here one cannot resist the impression that the earliest forms of the Greek mythology were derived from the Babylonians and Phoenicians, and that the Greek poets, availing themselves of the legends respecting them, created the popular religion of Greece. It is a mooted question whether the Greek civilization is chiefly derived from Egypt or from Assyria and Phoenicia, probably more from these old monarchies combined than from the original seat of the Aryan race east of the Caspian Sea. All these ancient monarchies had run out and were old when the Greeks began their settlements and conquests. There was still another and inferior class of deities among the Assyrians and Babylonians who were objects of worship and were supposed to have great influence on human affairs. These deities were the planets under different names. The early study of astronomy among the dwellers on the plains of Babylon and in Mesopotamia gave an astral feature to their religion, which was not prominent in Egypt. These astral deities were Nin or Bar, the Saturn of the Romans, and Merodach, Jupiter, the august god, the eldest son of heaven, the lord of battles. This was the favorite god of Nebuchadnezzar, and epithets of the highest honor were conferred upon him as king of heaven and earth, the lord of all beings, etc. Nergal, Mars, was a war god, his name signifying the great hero, the king of battles. He goes before kings in their military expeditions and lends them assistance in the chase. His emblem is the human-headed winged lion seen at the entrance of royal palaces. Ishtar, Venus, was the goddess of beauty, presiding over the loves of both men and animals, and was worshipped with unchaste rites. Nebo, Mercury, had the charge over learning and culture, the god of wisdom, who teaches and instructs. There were other deities in the Assyrian and Babylonian pantheon whom I need not name, since they played a comparatively unimportant part in human affairs, like the inferior deities of the Romans, presiding over dreams, over feasts, over marriage, and the like. The Phoenicians, like the Assyrians, had their goddesses. Astoreth, or Astarte, represented the great female productive principle, as Baal did the male. It was originally a name for the energy of God, on a par with Baal. In one of her aspects, she represented the moon, but more commonly, she was the representative of the female principle in nature and was connected more or less with voluptuous rites. The equivalent of Aphrodite or Venus. Tanith also was a noted female deity and was worshipped at Carthage and Cyprus by the Phoenician settlers. The name is associated, according to Gesenius, with the Egyptian goddess Nut and with the Grecian Artemis, the huntress. An important thing to be observed of these various deities is that they do not uniformly represent the same power. Thus, Baal, the Phoenician sun god, was made by the Greeks and Romans equivalent to Zeus or Jupiter, the god of thunder and storms. Apollo, the sun god of the Greeks, was not so powerful as Zeus, the god of the atmosphere, while in Assyria and Phoenicia the sun god was the greater deity. In Babylonia, Shamash was a sun god as well as Bel, and Bel again was the god of the heavens like Zeus, while Zeus was the supreme deity in the Greek mythology rather than Apollo the sun. It seems that on the whole the sun was the prominent and the most commonly worshipped deity of all the Oriental nations, as being the most powerful force in nature. Behind the sun, however, there was supposed to be an indefinite creative power whose form was not represented, worshipped in no particular temple by the esoteric few who were his votaries and called the Father of all the gods, the Ancient of Days, reigning supreme over them all. This indefinite conception of the Jehovah of the Hebrews seems to me the last flickering light of the primitive revelation shining in the souls of the most enlightened of the pagan worshippers, including perhaps the greatest of the monarchs who were priests as well as kings. The most distinguished feature in the worship of all the gods of antiquity, whether among Egyptians or Assyrians or Babylonians or Phoenicians or Greeks or Romans, is that of oblations and sacrifices. It was even a peculiarity of the old Jewish religion as well as that of China and India. These oblations and sacrifices were sometimes offered to the deity, whatever his form or name, as an expiation for sin, of which the soul is conscious in all ages and countries, sometimes to obtain divine favor, as in military expeditions, or to secure any object dearest to the heart, such as health, prosperity, or peace, sometimes to propitiate the deity in order to avert the calamities following his supposed wrath or vengeance. The oblations were usually in the form of wine, honey, or the fruits of the earth, which were supposed to be necessary for the nourishment of the gods, especially in Greece. The sacrifices were generally of oxen, sheep, and goats, and most valued and precious of human property in primitive times, for those old heathen never offered to their deities that which cost them nothing, but rather that which was dearest to them. Sometimes, especially in Phoenicia, human beings were offered in sacrifice, the most repulsive peculiarity of polytheism. But the instincts of humanity generally kept men from rites so revolting. Christianity, as one of its distinguishing features, abolished all forms of outward sacrifice as superstitious and useless. The sacrifice is pleasing to God. Her broken spirit, as revealed to David and Isaiah amid all the ceremonies and ritualism of Jewish worship, and still more to Paul and Peter, when the new dispensation was fully declared. The only sacrifice which Christ enjoined was self-sacrifice, supreme devotion to a spiritual and unseen and supreme God, and to his children, as the Christ took upon himself the form of a man, suffering evil all his days, and finally even an ignominious death, in obedience to his Father's will, that the world might be saved by his own self-sacrifice. With sacrifices as an essential feature of all the ancient religions, if we accept that of Persia in the time of Zoroaster, there was need of an officiating priesthood. The priests in all countries sought to gain power and influence and made themselves an exclusive caste. More or less powerful as circumstances favored their usurpations, the priestly caste became a terrible power in Egypt and India, where the people, it would seem, were most susceptible to religious impressions, were most docile and most ignorant, and had in constant view the future welfare of their souls. In China, where there was scarcely any religion at all, this priestly power was unknown, and it was especially weak among the Greeks, who had no fear of the future, and who worshipped beauty and grace rather than a spiritual God. Sacerdotalism entered into Christianity when it became corrupted by the lust of dominion and power, and with great force ruled the Christian world in times of ignorance and superstition. It is sad to think that the decline of sacerdotalism is associated with the growth of infidelity and religious indifference, showing how few worship God in spirit, and in truth, even in Christian countries. Yet even that reaction is humanly natural, and as it so surely follows upon epochs of priestcraft, it may be a part of the divine process of arousing men to the evils of superstition. Among all nations where polytheism prevailed, idolatry became a natural sequence. That is, the worship of animals and of graven images, at first as symbols of the deities that were worshipped, generally the sun, moon, and stars, and the elements of nature, like fire, water, and air, but the symbols of divine power, as degeneracy increased and ignorance set in, were in succession worshipped as deities, as in India and Africa at the present day. This is the lowest form of religion and the most repulsive and degraded which has prevailed in the world, showing the enormous difference between the primitive phase and the worship which succeeded, growing more and more hideous with the progress of ages, until the fullness of time arrived, when God sent reformers among the debased people, more or less supernaturally inspired to declare new truth, and even to revive the knowledge of the old, in danger of being utterly lost. It is a pleasant thing to remember that the religions thus far treated as known to the Jews, and by which they were more or less contaminated, have all passed away with the fall of empires and the spread of divine truth, and they never again can be revived in the countries where they nourished. Mohammedanism, a monotheistic religion, has taken their place and driven the ancient idols to the moles and the bats. And where Mohammedanism has failed to extirpate ancient idolatries, Christianity in some form has come in and dethroned them forever.